I'm Carmine Gallo with Dr. Ethan Kross. He is an award-winning psychology professor at the University of Michigan and author of Chatter. He's here to help us tame that negative inner voice in our heads that impedes our performance, especially in the area of public speaking. We'll get to that in a moment. Hi, Ethan. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while, Carmine.
Oh, I loved this book, especially since I see how it applies to so many areas of our lives. Ethan, tell me the difference between self-talk, we're always talking to ourselves, and what you mean by chatter. Is there a difference?
There's absolutely a difference. So, when we're talking about self-talk, what I mean is the ability to silently use language to reflect on your life. And language is a tool, and it's a tool that serves us well in lots of different circumstances. So just to give you a couple of examples, we talk to ourselves to keep things active in our heads. You go to the grocery store, hey, what do I have to buy? Milk, cheese, eggs. That's talking to yourself using language, right? You want to coach yourself through a problem. Hey, don't do this, don't do that, move the piece here. That's talking to yourself too. Preparing for a presentation. Like I know you spend a lot of time thinking about presentations. Oftentimes before I present to an audience, I'll go for a walk around my neighborhood and I'll rehearse what I'm going to say in my head. I'll go through the whole presentation. I'll take it to the end, and then I'll take it further. I'll simulate. I'll think about what's that really obnoxious person, what question are they going to ask me? And then I'll respond and I'll play that out. That's talking to myself. That's using language to simulate and plan, right? This is an incredibly valuable tool that we possess. I like to think of it as a kind of Swiss Army knife of the human mind. Now, there is a catch, because sometimes we try to use this tool when we're struggling, but we don't find ourselves benefiting from it. Instead, we get stuck in a negative thought loop. So we start rehearsing, oh my God, I can't do this presentation, or how am I going to, perform well on this date, or I can't believe I said that to that person. We get stuck in these negative thought loops that don't end up being productive, and they become, in fact, quite dysfunctional. That's what chatter is. And we know that chatter can be really toxic because it sinks us in 3 domains of life that I think really make life worth living. It undermines our performance. It undermines our relationships with other people, and it can undermine our physical health. So I think it's a big problem that we face as a species, and it's why I've spent so much time trying to figure out what we can do about it.
I think we all need that. I like the way you phrased it. It's a negative thought loop. That's chatter. I'd like to read a passage from your book. Chatter, undermines our performance at work, interferes with our ability to make good decisions, and negatively influences our relationships. It can also promote violence and aggression, contribute to a range of mental disorders, and enhance our risk of becoming physically ill. There's more. Chatter can cause otherwise rational, caring people to make less logical and even less moral decisions. It can lead friends to flee from you in both the real world and the social media world. It can turn romantic relationships from safe havens into battlegrounds. In short, our thoughts too often don't save us from our thoughts. Instead, they give rise to something insidious. Wow, Ethan, I guess I'd better start to think differently. Now you've really scared me with these negative thought loops.
Well, I think there are some really scary data out there which show how harmful these negative thought loops can be. The World Health Organization recently put a price tag on chatter in the form of anxiety and depression in the workplace. If I'm not mistaken, it was a 1 with several zeros after it, $1 trillion hit to the global world economy in terms of lost productivity and performance. So this is something to be concerned about, but I don't think we should experience chatter about the negative effects of chatter, because there's good news here. And the good news is that science has revealed a number of tools people can use to manage this aversive state. Some of these tools are things you could do on your own. There are tools that we can use in our relationships with other people. There are tools in our environment. I talk about 26 different tools in the book. So there really is a very, I think, positive end to this story about chatter. But it is something to think about for sure.
No, absolutely. The book and the tools are very empowering. And we're going to talk about 3 specific tools to relieve that anxiety over public speaking. But I have to tell you, Ethan, that when I was reading your book, I kept thinking about my golf game, because I think I play golf. It's a perfect example of what happens when negative self-talk enters our mind. And I think any person who's ever picked up a set of golf clubs will understand this scenario. And I have been dying to ask a psychology expert like you what's happening. And here's the scenario. I don't know if you play golf, but everyone experiences this. We're on the practice range. We're relaxed, hitting it just fine. In some cases, the best we've ever hit. Walk 100 yards to the first tee and everything unravels. What happens up here between the practice range and the first tee?
Well, it doesn't always happen. It happens at times. I'm sure you've had some wonderful games where you just cruise from that practice tee to the practice range to the first tee. And
oh, sure I do.
so how can we make
rarely, but yes,
how can we make that happen more often? And I have played it, so I have firsthand experience with this as well. When you are trying to swing a golf club, you basically have spent a lot of time creating a habit, creating a script, if you will, a program that is capable of running without thinking, muscle memory. The best thing you can do when you get to that tee is to just let that program run without trying to tweak it in the moment. What often ends up happening, though, is, look, it's quiet. Everyone's looking at us. We're thinking about the score we maybe want. And then we start to not just execute that script without thinking, but we start thinking, hey, is my elbow at the right angle? Is this where my instructor told me to put my elbow? Are my hips distributing well as I move back? And once you start focusing on the individual parts of a program, it breaks down. So the best thing you could do is to use tools to prevent yourself from micromanaging your swing, so to speak. That leads to something we call paralysis by analysis. I talk about this a little bit in the book. One of the reasons why you see so many athletes perform rituals right before a big event in the game, whether it be a free throw or on the golf course, right?
Field goal kickers do that a lot too. I've noticed.
Totally.
Football
is to focus their mind on something else that's under their control, and so that to keep their mind from going to, hey, is everything where it's supposed to be? So that would be one thing I'd recommend. Come up with a small ritual. And there's a lot of science to support that.
But isn't that an example, though, on a golf course or in athletic competition of chatter, of negative self-talk?
Absolutely. And we just saw this play out on the grandest scale of all in the Olympics with Simone Biles and the twisties, which, were so debilitating that it led her to withdraw from the event. So chatter is incredibly prevalent in professional sports. The stakes are really high. So there's a lot of attention on ourselves. We want to perform well. And there's often a lot of time for us to think. And sometimes giving ourselves time to think can be counterproductive. So yeah, very relevant.
Let's talk about a performance that all of us are familiar with that causes a great deal of anxiety and chatter, and that's public speaking. Why is it that the negative self-talk, or what you say is the chatter, why is it that when we are speaking in public, the chatter is amplified?
Well, we're social creatures. We crave approval and acceptance. We fear rejection. Rejection is among the most painful kinds of emotional experiences that we have. There's some research that I talk about in the book, which shows that actually it's in some ways akin to physical pain. Like you often describe feeling rejected as, "Oh, I'm in pain. I'm hurting." It's not just coincidence that we use that language to describe how we feel when we're rejected. And hey, guess what? Putting you on a public stage with other people who can evaluate you, this is giving you an opportunity to be rejected time and time again. So you really are putting people in a position to experience something that is quite painful. And as a result, it is a fear that a lot of people have. Now, as you know, and I know, and so many listeners know, that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, because the ability to speak publicly, to speak well, is an amazing skill that can serve you quite well. So the question is, how can you manage that more effectively, the chatter that comes from public speaking? And there are lots of tools that are useful. And in fact, some of the experiments I talk about in the book were done specifically around public speaking to figure out how you can help people do it more effectively.
So let's go through some of the tools.
Sure. So
let's go through some of the tools that we can use to, I wouldn't say eliminate the anxiety, but manage it.
I'm glad you brought up that distinction, because what we're often talking about with these tools is not ridding ourselves of negative emotions altogether. That would actually not be a good thing. Negative emotions serve a function. If I could tell you a short anecdote. So I do a lot of public speaking. And even though I've given hundreds and hundreds of over the course of my career, I still often get butterflies before a big event. And those butterflies are actually really useful, or a little ping of anxiety a couple of days before, because what they do is they alert me. They say, hey, time to start preparing, time to make sure your talking points are in order. There have been a few occasions where I have felt nothing before an engagement. And I have to say, on those engagements, I don't think they went as well. I wasn't as energized as I otherwise would be. And so the point here is that negative emotions, we evolve the capacity to experience them for a reason. They are functional in small doses. So we don't want to rid ourselves of negative emotions. We want to figure out how to contain them, to allow them to do what they're designed to do, help us focus our attention on specific things without consuming us in ways that can be quite harmful. When it comes to public speaking, what often happens is we tend to be, we initially become completely immersed in the fear. We focus, we zoom in on this situation as a threat, something that we can't necessarily manage. And what we've learned is that to the degree that people can use tools to help them look at the bigger picture, to zoom out a little bit, that can be really helpful for allowing them to reframe this opportunity, not as a threat, something I can't do, but a challenge that I can manage. And so one specific tool that we find is useful towards this end is something we call distanced self-talk. It involves using your name to coach yourself through a problem like you would give advice to someone else. We human beings, we're really good at giving advice to others, but we're not so good at taking our own advice, right? Do as I say, not as I do, is a common phrase. And what we've learned is that language can provide us with a tool for helping us think about our experiences more constructively, like we would, in a certain sense, think about someone else's problems. And it involves using your own name. So before I give a speech, all right, Ethan, get your act together. Here's how you're going to manage the situation. What that does, using your name, is it automatically shifts your perspective. You start coaching yourself through the situation like you would give advice to your best buddy. And an exercise I like to ask people to think through is, when you're experiencing chatter, would you ever tell your best friend what you're telling yourself in that moment?
No,
Never.
they wouldn't. Never. Right.
Never, right? You would say, here's how you should think about this. Put it in perspective. It's one speech among many, 45 minutes, you'll be done. And we find in studies that when we ask people to coach themselves through a situation using their name rather than I, that's exactly what they do. They get into this coach mode rather than this critic mode.
That is really interesting. So Carmine, you've got this. You've prepared for this presentation. These people are going to enjoy your ideas. Go out, nail it, have fun.
Yeah, and with
But
a
Carmine,
caveat,
not thinking about myself as I, but
that's
talking to
right.
myself and as a coach would.
That's right. And with one caveat, which is, especially if you're in public, you want to do that silently. You don't want to talk to yourself using your name out loud as you're walking down the streets of San
Right.
Francisco. That can activate the
Yes.
wrong kinds of associations.
Yeah.
Fine to do it in the privacy of your own home, but
That's
yeah,
a
I do
good
expect
caveat. Thanks for
that.
that.
But
Distant
let
self-talk.
me ask you, Carmine. I mean,
Yes.
it's very it's visceral. I can feel the difference when I start referring to myself using my name as compared to I. Do you experience something similar? It's a very noticeable shift in the way that I'm communicating with myself.
I think that I've used a version of that tool. I think I've done that. I think I have used distant self-talk. I just haven't done it intentionally or even thought about it. So the fact that you actually put a name to it, I think is interesting.
I think I'm so glad you said that. In the book, I actually talk about many examples of many famous people who who have done this under stress. LeBron James, Jennifer Lawrence, Julius Caesar, Henry Adams. And it's fascinating to me that some people just stumble on this tool in their life. I think the value of understanding the science behind it is that, exactly as you just said, it gives us the opportunity to be a lot more deliberate about how we recruit this technique in our lives. So I don't have to wait to just kind of figure out, that helped me. I know the moment I have something stressful approaching, I start doing this technique proactively to prevent that chatter from spiraling.
Let's talk about two other tools that we can use to manage our anxiety and our stress and our negative inner talk during public speaking. The second tool, reframe your experience as a challenge. What does that mean?
So when you put a person in a situation involving a social threat, which is exactly what public speaking involves, people typically ask themselves two kinds of questions, and they often do this subconsciously. The first thing they do is they scan the situation and they say, what's required of me? What do I have to do? And then they say, do I have the resources that are needed to do what's required of me? If you ask those two questions and you say, nope, can't do it, that elicits what we call a threat response, which predicts poor performance and poor physiological reactions to the situation. If, on the other hand, you scan the situation, okay, here's what's required. And then you think, here's what I have to do. And you say, yeah, I can manage this. That elicits what we call a challenge orientation or a challenge response. And that predicts better performance and better physiological reactions to the situation. Now, the cool thing about this challenge threat response is that it's malleable. So knowing how this works, you can now choose to reframe how you're experiencing something that is really aversive, to not think about it as a threat, but to think about it as a challenge instead. So let me be very concrete about how someone might do this. I show up for a big meeting. There are lots of very influential people in the room, and I'm told, all of a sudden, all right, we want you to give 10 minutes talk on your research and life work. Oh my God, can I do this? And my initial reaction might be threat. Holy shit, this is going to be the end of me. I can't manage this. But I can make the choice, knowing how all this works, to reframe it and say, you know what, Ethan, you've done this before. And you can do it again. Notice I'm actually using my name reflexively to help me do that there, right? You can give them 10 minutes. You often talk for 3 hours to people without stopping. And even if you stumble a little bit, you'll get the message across, and then you can go get a coffee and move on to the next thing. So I've made the choice to change the narrative, and changing the narrative in that way, away from threat and towards challenge, can make a tremendous difference when it comes to our ability to perform in front of others under stress.
So that that threat response is what causes the sweaty palms and the elevated heart rate.
That's right. So, well, it's really, I find this fascinating. So when you're experiencing challenge or threat, your heart rate is going up. And your heart rate is going up because look, there is objectively something that is requiring like an elevated response in front of you, right? You're not going for a massage here. You're not going to watch a Hallmark special on TV. You've got to perform. The difference between the challenge threat is your heart's beating really fast, blood's going to the body. When you have a threat response, your vasculature, your veins and arteries, they start constricting. And so what happens when you've got a lot of blood pumping into a progressively narrower space? There's not a whole lot of room for the blood to flow. And that's how you get bursted vessels, which are not good for our health. With a challenge response, your blood is still being pumped at a high rate out of your heart, but your vasculature constricts. So there's room for that blood to flow effortlessly throughout the body, allowing you to engage in that situation most adaptively. And so that's physiologically the difference between the two.
So that leads to our third tool, which is reinterpret your body's chatter response.
Yeah, so a lot of people, when they experience chatter in general, but also, of course, in public speaking contexts, they sense the butterflies in the stomach, and their elevated heart rate and the sweating, and those symptoms, those biological responses themselves end up fueling the chatter, becoming a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. Oh my God, I'm sweating. This means I must not be able to do it. And then the stomach pangs even more, and then the chatter just goes further.
I'm looking at the tools, by the way. I have a whole subsection on all the tools we've been talking about.
That's right. They're all listed in the back. And what ends up happening in that situation is not good. So what research shows can be helpful is reframe how you're thinking about those symptoms. Rather than thinking about them as a sign of doom and gloom that you're going to falter, think about this response as, hey, this is what my body is designed to do via evolution in this situation, right? I'm sweating, my heart is beating faster because I've got something that's challenging in front of me. So this is just my body just rising to the occasion. And so that reframe of how you think about those bodily symptoms of a stress response can be very useful for preventing you from worrying about those symptoms.
Ethan, I believe as you write in the book, that if we can understand and harness the power of our inner voice, that we will lead more satisfying, more productive, more successful lives. So thank you for drawing our attention to it. Thanks, Ethan.
Thanks for having me.